medias have been inundated with a number of questions and requests. People asking, what did I think of the G20? What did I think of the B20? Did I go? What did I think of the deliberations or the drama that surrounded this G20 and B20 summit? So here is my quick take on the G20. First, it really matters what you call this G20. Do we call it the boycott summit? Do we call it the global south takeover? There could be trillions for transition, whatever you want to call it. But what is pretty clear is that this is a momentous time in history. Let's talk first about the symbolism. It's important that the G20 is held for the first time on African soil, in my country of birth and love, South Africa, the greatest country in the world. I should tell you, everywhere in the world I tell people this. I should also say that last week I spoke at the Time Africa gathering around G20 and B20, and I said to the people there, welcome to South Africa, the greatest country in the world. So I genuinely believe that we live in the most beautiful country in the world. But what does this summit mean, not only for South Africa, but also for the people in Africa, the global south as well, and then, of course, the rest of the world? So let's get into some of the details about what's happened at this summit. First, let's do some context setting. So I've got my notes here, just so I make sure that I'm on the vibe in terms of what the facts are. And just to make sure that the stuff that I communicate to you is accurate in terms of what were some of the outcomes. So first, let's have a discussion about the politicians. Of course, there was the drama around whether or not Donald Trump would eventually allow some sort of participation from the Americans. I should say that as I understood it last week, I'm off social media, but as I understood it last week, there was some sort of contagion or argument between the South Africans and the Americans about what it would mean for the Americans to participate and what participation.
If I was rich, I would also be out of social media. I can promise you right now, if I was rich, I would never be on social media. Me, I can promise you right. I can tell you right now. I don't know what would I be doing there. But if I was rich, like in G, I would be hearing you saying, hey, on social media, social media.
Actually meant. I think there are a few points to make here, and I heard Minister, I think it's in Ncheveni, make this point, but I'd made a similar point to somebody circa 2-3 weeks ago when this whole thing started. I'm just Vusi, like I'm just a guy. And yet, even when I travel into countries, we've got a security team that helps us in the firm with risk assessment and analysis, not only for myself, but the other executives in the business. So even when I travel into countries, there is typically a process to follow. This process includes, sending a reconnaissance person or team into the country to do reconnaissance, to go and check the routes, the travel, the hotel, the place we're staying, the airports, all of those things. So you don't arrive and get surprised. And I'm a private citizen. Could you imagine then if you were the Deputy President of the United States? Like, how much forewarning goes into you traveling into the country? So let's set a few things aside. First, even before it was announced by the White House that there would be no participation by the United States, I can assure you that the people from the United States had already started the reconnaissance. Firstly. Secondly, a very dear friend of mine works in the security sector, private security, and she made me aware that she was a part of the people who was doing some or other work that had to do with the security and risk assessments by the United States of America. So there was already stuff done to get the Americans into the country, which is to say, when the decision came from the White House that they would not participate, I am almost sure that money had already been spent on this, but I'm almost sure that it would have had second-order effects. And some of these second-order effects would be a cancellation then of protocol rights, a cancellation of access rights, a cancellation of VIP rights, and a whole host of other things, right? They would have had to remove those from the system because somebody could use those to get into the venue and God knows do what with it. That then notwithstanding, when, as I think it was communicated last week, that somebody would be allocated by the United States Embassy, which I should tell you is about as near as makes no difference from where I'm sat, maybe 50 meters from my office. Like my office is, as the gyro flies, about 50 meters from the American Embassy. So it was then said by Washington that somebody would go from the embassy and go into the summit, and I think to collect whatever it was that came out of the summit. Whatever you say, here is what is pretty clear. First, it's pretty clear that the attempts to resolve the issues between South Africa and the United States is a long way from over still. Even after President Cyril Ramaphosa went to the White House, it's pretty clear we're a long way from those issues being resolved. Secondly, it's pretty clear that we're not in an era of diplomacy by any degree of reason. It's pretty clear. Like, we're at the era of diplomacy by who can say the most, who can bully the most. I heard the president, I believe it's the spokesperson for the United States president, said that she had heard that the South African president was running his mouth. I mean, excuse my language, holy shit. How do you say that about another head of state, right? And I think that level of language demonstrates the contemptuous nature of that relationship. So for what it's worth, to all South Africans watching this, set aside your expectations. We're not going to, at any point in time, have any level of cordial relationships at a nation-state level between South Africa and the United States. I don't see it, not as long as these two administrations are in power. That's just my assessment from afar. But here's what it did mean for the context of this conference taking place. So the United States snubbed the conference. There was no representation at the G20 level. I should tell you, at B20, I think they were the first or the second most represented nation state in the business conversations was United States and United States businesses. They have to be. There's something in an order of 400 to 600 American companies operating in South Africa, right? So the United States snubbed the G20. But of course, Argentina did something similar, and there are things said about how close the relationship is between, Trump and Milei. Say whatever you will about that. That notwithstanding, though, Africa, Asia, in particular Southeast Asia, Latin America, dominated the room. Absolutely dominated the room. The G20 countries usually represent 85% of the global economy. 85%. Without the United States, a massive 25% of the GDP influence was missing from the room. 25%. So for sure, that has something to do with the materiality of some of the declarations and resolutions that have been made, but notwithstanding, those declarations and resolutions were made nonetheless. At a B20 level, I think a big part of the conversation there obviously centered on this risk tax that Africa pays. And what I'm going to do for you is I'll explain a bit about this risk tax in a minute. But let's go back to the point about the G20. So what were the outcomes? What were the wins? What were the things that came out of that I think you need to be aware of? I love this, and I heard one of the pundits say it, that there was a declaration basically to the order of the minerals are ours. Go and read, I think it's Sobukwa's book, The Land is Ours, right? And I think it's a poetic borrowing of the titling of that book, this idea that the minerals are ours. And the point here is that it was argued by the delegation coming from many parts of Africa that Africa is tired of shipping dirt and buying finished products. We, some time ago in our firm, in our consulting firm, Iconoclast Knowledge Bureau, went through government policy documents and speeches, and we looked for the first time in South Africa specifically that a South African head of state mentioned the word beneficiation, and we could trace it back to around 1997. Now, it probably has been said before, we couldn't find record of it. But we were looking at, for the first time, a South African head of state in the new South Africa spoke about beneficiation. We could trace it back to the year 1997, which means the conversation about beneficiation has been happening for close on 30 years now. What the G20 has resolved, though, is that now they want beneficiation at source, and they've adopted this. What this quite simply means is that in the country where the minerals are mined, beneficiation should take place. Let me tell you that if a smidge of this takes place, it would be transformative for the economics of all of Africa. To date, currently, Africa captures something like 5% of all of its minerals, 5% of the value creation of all of its minerals. Could you imagine what would happen if we just double that number, triple that number, maybe just quadruple that number? Let's get to 25, 30, 40%. What would it look like then? So processing locally could increase revenues of these countries by hundreds of billions of dollars. And it's not something that should be snubbed at. This is actually a very important and a very material point. Where I come from, in the East Rand, a big part of the large industries around where I grew up were industries based around beneficiation. So around the Benoni, Boksburg, Brakpan area were these like mines where stuff would be mined. And between the mines and somewhere where the factory was, there was a train that was built where you would move the goods from the mine into some sort of processing plant or some sort of beneficiation plant. Then from there, you'd move it into some sort of production plant where you would convert it into a finished product. Then it would go into the manufacture process and then, of course, into the sales process. So all of these things were taking place in South Africa at the time, in part because the apartheid economy was built around import substitution. But the point here is that if all of these African countries can get right this idea of beneficiating at source, it changes the unit economics of Africa. The second point was the debt trap and debt reform. I'm on the record with this, and I spend a lot of time traveling the continent, so I can speak about this with some semblance of authority, given the extent of my travel in the continent and my proximity to some of the people who work in either treasury functions or finance departments or even developmental finance institutions all across the continent at the highest levels. I can make this statement with some semblance of authority that Africa, frankly, is overtaxed when it comes to its debt servicing costs. The fact is that African countries are just paying way too much debt servicing costs to be able to afford doctors. Now, what most people don't understand is this. Every dollar that goes into paying an interest charge is a dollar that doesn't go into social services, and it's a dollar that doesn't go into infrastructure. So for nation states, they've got to make a decision between do they pay for healthcare facilities, roads, ports, schools, or do they pay for the debt servicing costs for debt that they would have raised to often actually just run their budgets, not even take on capital expenditure programs. And so this summit committed to reforming the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, who, it should be said by several people, were actually lambasted for issuing predatory loans to some nation states. And it'll be interesting to see where that opens. I listened to Professor Jeffrey Sachs speak about the fact that a part of the reason this is the case is because of where the IMF and the World Bank are located, right? And when they were founded, by the way, right? When they were founded and where they are geographically located, that gives them the compass of how their policy direction is being oriented and being driven. These are the views of Professor Jeffrey Sachs. In last year, in 2020, I caught the stat and it just caught my eye. Developing nations paid $921 billion in interest alone.
What?
That's not the principal amount of the loans. That's interest. $921 billion for developing nations. Said differently, the GDP of Africa, last I checked, was circa $2.8 trillion. In other words, the debt servicing costs of all developing nations is something like 30%, 33% of the GDP of all of Africa. I mean, that's just untenable. Today, 22 African countries spend more on debt interest than they do on public health care. More on debt than on taking care of sick people in their countries. It's extraordinary that these are the things that are happening, but this is the world we're at. So the second point they made there was that you got to reform these financing institutions, and you've got to look at the role that the International Monetary Fund plays, the World Bank plays, and how these institutions are sometimes perpetuating a system where the global financial architecture is being used to keep the disadvantaged disadvantaged. This is why you would have heard somewhere in the politics people talk about a re-engineering of the global financial architecture system, right? You would have seen the developing nations forming their own new developing bank or something like this, which is often colloquially referred to as the BRICS Bank. These are all the aims at making sure that they can change the debt servicing costs for developing nations. So that's the second point. The third was the Green Pledge. Now, this one is interesting. I myself have views on the green economy, but this one is interesting. So there was a promise that came out to triple the renewable energy spending, and this time with actual money. South Africa confirmed that it had targeted a 45 gigawatts of renewable energy by the year 2035. 45 gigawatts. To put it in context, the current generation capacity in South Africa, as I understand it, is somewhere around 63 gigawatts. So that's close on 80%, maybe a little bit more, of the current generation capacity that South Africa has committed to by the year 2035 in renewables. It's up, by the way, this 45 is up from around 17. So massive, massive, massive commitment there. And to kickstart it, the Cross-Boundary Energy Project has pledged $1 billion specifically for African projects. So specifically for African projects. So that sets aside the G20. Lots of arguing, lots of, riff-raff, who's coming, who's not, and all of these commitments made. But I think what's important for you as a viewer watching this is understanding some of the headline numbers, because those headline numbers are important. You will begin to see, as a viewer watching this channel, that even in the country that you're in, it's probable that you're going to see your governments begin to articulate policy positions based on some of these pledges that they would have made at the G20 Summit. So that's the government.
You know, every time when a person speaks about what the government maybe want to do, or based on the pledges that they've made and all of that, and also the country, what exactly do they want out of that, okay? Just like he actually said that South Africa has pronounced that they are going to be looking to get whatever gigabytes that he's talking about or anything. And he spoke about also the money thing and say it's going to be actual money. Every time a person says that, and you are thinking about our government, already you know what's going on in here. Maybe it's me, but you are like, okay. There are some people who are going to be starting to, you get my point, right? There will be some other people who will be celebrating because of that, because of it, especially if it's going to be actual money. Because if it's not actual money, then it's better, because, but if it's actual money, we know our history, right? But anyway, I just wanted to react to all of these guys. Very informative, Mr. Vusi Thembekwayo. Thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. You know Mr. Vusi Thembekwayo. You can go and watch the whole half of the video where he's going to be talking about business, okay? I just wanted to concentrate on the government part. We are hoping that the intentions of our government is good, right? Whatever that they have decided they are going to do there, and whatever that they have pledged to do, I hope that they are going to do it as per their intentions, which are good intentions, okay? Anyway, thank you guys for watching. Like, share, subscribe.